So thank you for choosing to be part of this spiritual community today. We know you have lots of choices in the hybrid world, and we're delighted you chose to spend your time with us now. This week and next week, I'm going to be reminding us about all the hard parts of the science of mind philosophy. They're not hard because they're hard to understand or esoteric in any way. They're hard because they require us to consistently take action, regardless of whether or not we get feedback that's positive or immediate or feels good. This is not like T-ball for little kids where you get an award for showing up. You kind of do, but not really. You have to do the work and you have to persist and continue to persist, regardless of whether or not something happens in your immediate life. So Dr. Holmes starts out this chapter on page 51.1 in The Science of Mind with a charge and a challenge. We can see it as encouraging or discouraging, depending on our level of interest in actually doing the work. It goes like this. One of the great difficulties in the new order of thought is that we're likely to indulge in too much theory and too little practice. As a matter of fact, we only know as much as we can prove by demonstration. That which we cannot prove may or may not be true, but that which we can prove certainly must be and is true. Doesn't that just bite? Because here it is, it's like in our face, it's on our plate. We have to do what's ours to do in order to get the experience that we want. And yet that's how life works, right? Life gives us what we are, not what we want. We have to change our thinking, which most of the time is a slow, stepwise process, until we automatically think along the lines of the life we desire. It doesn't have to take years to change our thinking, but it often does because we fight against it or we interfere with the good that we say we desire. There are exceptions, of course, highly motivated individuals who really are ready to create a different life experience. For them, it happens. And usually it's because the life they were living before is too small or too limiting or too unhealthy in some way. And when they're ready, it becomes simple to turn over a new leaf and have a different experience. Some of you remember hearing Terry Mcbride's story. He had a horrible, incurable disease. He was going to be basically bedridden. The medical establishment, if he was lucky, he was going to be bedridden. The medical establishment gave him nearly zero hope of having any quality of life. He decided he was going to have a different reality. He was going to have a different experience. And it took him years of daily practice, of prayer and visualization to see himself healthy and whole. And no matter how many setbacks he experienced, no matter how long it took, no matter how many surgeries it took, how many hours and hours of PT it took, he never gave up. He succeeded with grit and determination and an absolutely rock solid, regular daily spiritual practice. He wouldn't take no for an answer. His book, the title of which makes me laugh, The Hell I Can't, tells his story. It's impressive. Terry's expressive. He's over the top. And you see why if you read his story. And some of you remember Mary Morrissey's story. Back when she was in high school, some number of years ago, she was a cheerleader. She was on homecoming court, the whole business, right? She got pregnant with her college-age boyfriend when he came home for spring break one year. Well, that's a bummer. She felt ashamed with her pregnancy and shamed by society, dropped by her friends because their parents disapproved, and she felt like she disappointed her family. The high school principal called her into the office and said, "Mary, what are you doing? We can't have you here with the normal girls. You're pregnant. It's like you're going to infect them or something with pregnancy." So he kicked her out of the school and sent her to finish school across the river with the other pregnant girls and delinquent boys. She internalized that shame in her own body and ended up in the hospital with terminal, fatal kidney disease. One kidney was completely destroyed, and the other one was only half working. Back then, I told you it was some time ago, back then there were no kidney transplants, there was no dialysis, nothing. There was no hope and no possibility of recovery. Well, I decided to look in Louise Hay in her book, You Can Heal Your Life, yesterday when I was working on this talk. Not surprising, the most probable cause of kidney problems was a reaction to criticism, disappointment, failure, and shame. And interestingly, reacting like a little kid, throwing a temper tantrum, throwing a fit. So back to Mary's story. The doctors were going to remove the destroyed kidney and then send her home, make her comfortable, and send her home to die because there was nothing they could do for her. The night before her surgery, a hospital chaplain came in who happened, right? We know how things happen, who happened to be versed in New Thought teachings. And this chaplain talked to her and offered to pray with her. And he asked her about her history. After Mary told the story, I think it was a she, the hospital chaplain, but I'm not sure, so I'm going to assume it was a she. Eventually, she asked Mary if she could imagine her body is healed, completely healed, no destroyed kidney or nothing, just healed. Mary said no. And then she asked Mary if she could imagine all those negative feelings and all that bad juju going into the kidney the doctors were going to take out. And Mary conceded that could be possible. The chaplain used that tiny opening to suggest that Mary could get better, something the doctors gave her no hope of. The catch was Mary had to change her mental focus. She had to look away from shame and disappointment and feeling like she'd screwed up permanently. And she had to shift her awareness to the good that she desired, the positive experience she wished to focus on with all her heart. The way Mary told the story, she said she didn't believe it was possible, but she saw this chaplain person did. So she decided to have faith in the chaplain's faith and do whatever the chaplain told her to do. And so every time she started feeling bad about her story, her history, she stopped herself and she decided to focus again on the good she desired. She decided to focus on seeing her child go to kindergarten, seeing her child graduate from high school, seeing her child graduate from college, seeing her child get married. And so she shifted from this negative backstory she had to this good she desired. And miraculously, the kidney that was half destroyed recovered. The doctors couldn't imagine what was going on because it didn't fit their paradigm, but she knew what was going on. She didn't understand it, but she knew. And it's a bit of a miraculous story to us, right? But it's not really miraculous when you understand that it's what we believe and engage in that gives us the life of our experience, that gives us the life of our choosing. And here's the work, right? We have to believe, have faith, and actively be involved in creating this design future that we wish. And just in case you only think it works with health issues, I'll remind you of another story that many of you know. Turn of the 1900s. The woman's name is Genevieve Barron. She's a lonely young widow living on a small pension, which is enough, but no extra. She lived in the Northeast US, I want to say like Boston or someplace, and she stumbled onto a copy of the Edinburgh and Doré lectures by Thomas Troward. She struggled with reading Troward with his long, convoluted, cumbersome sentences. Those of you that are taking the Troward class should be laughing right now, because they're dense and complicated and sometimes seem awfully circular. And she struggled with them, but she kept reading because she knew there was some good stuff in here. And in the Doré lectures, she found a series of statements, sentences that would eventually become like a mantra for her and form the basis of her minute by minute practice. The statement read, "My mind is a center of divine operation. This divine operation is always for expansion, always for fuller expression. And this means the production of something beyond what has gone before, something entirely new, not included in past experience, though proceeding out of it by an orderly sequence of growth. Therefore," I told you his sentences were long, right? "Therefore, since the divine cannot change its inherent nature, it must operate in the same manner with me. Consequently, in my own special world, of which I am the center, it will move forward to produce new conditions, always in advance of anything that has gone before." Reading these words gave Genevieve hope. Memorizing them and repeating them to herself often and often and often gave her encouragement. Acting as though they were true moved her into the practice of proving the words were true. She decided she wanted to go study with this guy in England. This is back in the days before airplanes. She wrote him and expressed her interest. He wrote back, "Thank you for your letter, no." He turned her down over and over and over again, but she persisted. She almost was a stalker, right? She started methodically and consistently arranging and aligning her consciousness as someone who would succeed at this. She visualized her transatlantic voyage. She visualized having the money to pay for it. She visualized buying the ticket, standing on the ship railing, waving at her friends, going across the ocean, getting there, getting in a horse-drawn buggy, riding up to his house, knocking on his door, and having him agree to work with her. Every bit of this was in her imagination, and not a bit of it had any support in the world of form. Nothing. He had told her no. She decided the answer was yes. So she worked it. She repeated her mantra. She worked it. She imagined it. She focused on the good she desired. Even as the money showed up, she got on the boat. She got to England. She found a place to stay. She got in the horse-drawn buggy. She went to his house. He invited her in, and he's still saying no. And she's still not taking no for an answer because she's decided. Talk about power. Eventually, he says, "Okay, I'm giving some lectures. You can come if you want." And so she showed up for the lectures and stayed engaged with him. And then he says, "Okay, I've got a puzzle for you. If you can figure it out, I'll work with you." And it was some bizarre thing from Revelations that was completely cryptic. And she worked out the puzzle because she followed the breadcrumb trail that existed because she was so convinced that this was her path. Like I said, it was almost like stalking. And so she solved the puzzle and he agreed to work with her. And she was his only pupil. He had no others. So we have this ability within ourselves, if we're willing to do the work that is ours to do. So then, what does it take to prove to ourselves that we know? And what does it take for us to prove to ourselves that we know that we know? And then how do we stop ourselves from negating our knowing by regurgitating our pre-programmed self-limiting ideas? And at the same time, how do we do this and not pretend that something is true when it isn't? Talk about complicated. We have to engage with the practices of this teaching. Sorry, there's no other shortcut. There's no silver bullet. Engaging in the practice, meditation, sitting in the awareness of the presence, and knowing it lives in us and as us all the time, whether we feel it or not. Affirmative prayer, persistently and consistently claiming the good we desire for ourselves, discarding anything and everything that doesn't align with that good within ourselves, in our experience, in our world, and then acting accordingly. That's the silver bullet. Sorry, it is. It doesn't look like a shortcut. It looks like the long way, but really it's not. It is the most direct way to have the experience of our good that we desire. So what does acting accordingly look like? Studying spiritually uplifting materials, being generous with our time, talent, and treasure, and service to ourselves and to others. And we each get to define what those things mean for ourselves. There's not a one size fits all. There's not a minimum daily requirement. Everybody's path is their own. So I want to repeat the words I used last week in the closing from Mike Dooley, a most improbable source of guidance, but whatever, right? Probably, not necessarily, but probably the shortest distance between here and there, between today and the life of your wildest dreams, runs through joy. As much of it as you can possibly stir up. But that's only if you're in a hurry. If you really want to take your time, there's always boredom, indifference, impatience, and decaf. So if your desired good doesn't bring you joy, doesn't increase the joy in your world, you might want to look again. If it has to be done as a chore or struggle or hardship, that's probably not the divine idea of good. From last week's reading in The Science of Mind, page 46, paragraph 3, it should be considered right to live and enjoy living. To be well, happy, and to express freedom is to be in accord with the divine law and wisdom. There is latitude enough for the most expectant and the most enthusiastic. So now, having cleared all that up, what goes on in our minds and bodies when we pretend something is true, but we don't actually believe it's true? You could call this a spiritual bypass if you want, pretending, lying to ourselves, saying that all is well when it really isn't. And it could be saying an affirmation that we want to believe, but we don't believe it. Think about that for a second. What's one thing? What's one thought or idea that you want to believe so strongly, but you don't believe it? If you try to convince yourself otherwise, saying an affirmation you don't believe, what goes on in your mind? What goes on in your body? Usually, there's some disagreement or some disconnect or some smart alecky comment, some tightening of your gut or some physical discomfort. When we have a disconnect between what we're saying in our mind and what we actually believe, or what we're saying with our mouth, and we actually don't believe, we are not congruent. We have to notice those incongruencies, those discomforts, those disconnects, and make adjustments. So how do we deal with that? We have to figure out what we actually do believe and start there. Just like Mary Morrissey didn't believe she could be well, but she did believe the chaplain believed she could be well. And she did believe the chaplain believed she could watch her son grow up and get married and have a life, if she managed her mind. And she hooked her belief to that belief. So how do we use this? We have to know what we believe first. And then we have to see what we desire to believe and figure out what steps we can take that move us in that direction. And we can't wish for the $1 million, but we can see ourselves as 1% more prosperous. We can't necessarily see ourselves as, if this is your goal, we can't necessarily see ourselves in a loving relationship, but we can see ourselves relating more kindly, more generously, more loving, and receiving that back. So it's a stepwise process that moves us in the direction. And it's a combination of things, right? How do we use this teaching? First, we learn it, and then we start applying it. We embody it. We continuously, daily work on our own minds to get the vision, get the idea, and engage in that way. And we get back up every single time we fall down, because it's not one and done, ever. And we live as if this desired good was possible for us. We live like it's ours to experience when we open up and allow it. And we do it by knowing the best for ourselves and our friends we haven't met yet. And we do our best to focus on what is good and beautiful and true. It's a lot, right? It's a huge job. And it all happens in our minds and our ability to focus our attention and intention on what we desire to have. And being honest with ourselves about where we are now and what's between us and that, and moving ourselves in that direction. So I want to close with the final conclusion in The Science of Mind. It's on page 423 if you want to look it up later. In conclusion, what the world needs is spiritual conviction, followed by spiritual experience. I would rather see a student of this science prove its principle than to have them repeat all the words of wisdom that have ever been uttered. It's far easier to teach this truth than it is to practice it, because practice it is hard sometimes. But the practice of the truth is personal to each, and in the long run, no one can live our life for us. To each is given what they need, and the gifts of heaven come alike to all. How shall we use these gifts is all that matters. To hold one's thoughts steadfastly to the constructive, to that which endures, to the truth, may not be easy in a rapidly changing world. But to the one who makes the attempt, much is guaranteed. The essence of spiritual mind healing and of all true religious philosophy is the inner realization of the presence of perfection within and round about. So take a breath. It's a big challenge. It's a big chore. And it is what's the path of living this science of mind teaching for each one of us. And everyone's path is going to be different. Figure out what your path is. Figure out what your desire is. Be honest with where you are and what steps you can actually imagine delivering on, imagine doing, imagine living that move you in the direction of your dream. That's how you get there. That's how you experience and express this great good. Do that. Bless yourself and bless us all. Thank you. So I want to roll into the prayer, this affirmative prayer thing that we do, this spiritual mind treatment. Because it's in remembering that divine that lives in, as, and through each one of us that I am able to see the divine mind as love and peace and joy and harmony and ease and goodness. And I know that each of those qualities live in me and live as me and as each one. And as I remember to align my focus and intention on these qualities of goodness, my life conforms more readily to them. And I know that even though stuff will happen and I will fall down, I have the opportunity, because I am one in this divine mind, as are each and all. I have this opportunity to rearrange my thinking, to refocus my attention, and claim this goodness. And so I relax into that and know that it's not a struggle, it's just a practice. And that ability and opportunity is alike available to all. So I relax into the flow and I accept that flow as part of my present reality. And I relax into the goodness and I let it be. And so it is.